Dominic Cummings goes after the Supreme Court and the Whitehall establishment, and Boris Johnson rejects the European Union's demands on Brexit. Well, I'm back in London. We had a very productive trip to New York for a couple of weeks, but it was time to get back home and sort things out here. A lot has happened in the last week or so. Obviously, Dominic Cummings, ever since he got his job as the chief advisor to Boris Johnson, he's been planning a lot of reforms to tackle the Whitehall establishment, but also the BBC, and now the Supreme Court. So we're going to talk about that in this video, but also the negotiations between the UK and the EU. As you may know, the European Union have had some ridiculous demands when it comes to the trade negotiations, so we'll talk about that towards the end of this video. But first, let's start with the reshuffle, because we had the reshuffle with the cabinet. We had some changes. We have a new Attorney General who's a robust Brexiteer, and also she's a massive opponent to the Supreme Court. So everybody's been kicking off because of Suella Braverman. Yes, our new Attorney General, Suella Braverman, has said that judges should stay out of politics. She actually used to be a barrister herself, but she's been campaigning against the Supreme Court becoming political and biased. Suella Braverman has replaced Geoffrey Cox as the government's most senior lawyer, as the Prime Minister obviously did the reshuffle. She has said that prorogation and the triggering of Article 50 were merely the latest examples of a chronic and steady encroachment by the judges. For in reality, repatriated powers from the EU will mean precious little if our courts continue to act as political decision maker, pronouncing on what the law ought to be. Traditionally, Parliament made the law and judges applied it, but today our courts exercise a form of political power. Well, she's absolutely spot on, because firstly, the whole establishment, the creation of the Supreme Court was a ridiculous idea that Tony Blair came up with when we had the Labour government. When it comes to the British system, the Supreme Court has no place in it, because it just doesn't apply to the way we do business in this country. They try to turn it into a more American style of a governance, but you can't just add one aspect of the American system and then keep everything else the same when it comes to the House of Commons. So the whole thing doesn't work. That's why Boris Johnson, not only using Suella Braverman to actually look into the Supreme Court, he's actually appointed Michael Gove to be in charge of constitutional reform. Yes, Michael Gove will be overseeing the UK's constitutional review. As the Cabinet Office Minister, he's expected to obviously look at the alleged political interferences by our judges. Now, Michael Gove is basically set to take the political lead in Boris Johnson's upcoming constitutional review that will examine the role of British judges and the use of judicial review. Government officials said that the constitutional review would be overseen by the Cabinet Office, which is headed by Mr. Gove, who will work alongside Justice Secretary Robert Buckland and Suella Braverman, the new Attorney General. Now, many Conservatives obviously believe that judges have become more prepared to interfere in the political issues, and this has happened when it comes to Brexit and other problems that we've had recently. This is why Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's chief advisor, is now behind this move. He said apparently that he wants to get the judges sorted, and he's naturally asked Michael Gove to sort it out because he's trusted to do it, and this is obviously coming from a government insider. Now, there are a lot of people in the Tory government, whether in the cabinet or the advisors or the civil servants, who have been trying to be difficult when it comes to this shake-up that we need in the country.
I find with all the Prime Minister's advisors, Dominic Cummings included, and they're there to provide advice, to provide challenge, if you like, and have a good debate about things. But it's not the case that things necessarily go Dominic Cummings' way or anyone else. And take HS2 this last week is a big decision that Dominic will have had views about. I had views about. In the end,
did you clash with him on it?
It's not about always have. Sorry, say again.
Did you clash with him on it then?
No, clash is just the wrong way to describe it. We discussed it. We discussed our varying views, and we came to a conclusion. But the idea that just because Dominic thinks something, that's what happens, is clearly not the case, as in this example. But it doesn't mean that you clash with or fall out with or whatever. I value the advice. The Prime Minister values the advice, and we come to better decisions by making sure we're analysing all the data, particularly in the case of something like HS2.
And this is why we had the reshuffle, and we had some challenges and encounters, for example, between Dominic Cummings and Sajid Javid. Sajid Javid and people like him, obviously, and his side of the political machine were more of obviously the kind of cautious side, trying to keep everything the same and let's not go too far with reform. That's why Sajid Javid had to go. That's the whole idea was they asked him to fire his advisors to replace them with better people. And they weren't actually expecting Sajid Javid to say no, but he actually did resign himself. But this reshuffle is only the start of a Whitehall revolution, which obviously began by having Sajid Javid and others like him, whether it was again special advisors or the civil servants, to leave. In other words, there is history to this week's reshuffle, and it's not just Brexit, nor is it purely about grudges or power struggles. Yeah, Boris Johnson wants loyalty and competence, and he wasn't getting it obviously from Sajid Javid's Treasury team, and that is why Sajid Javid in turn did not really fancy becoming Number 10's voiceless minion, in his words, but and he left. But Boris Johnson has chosen as his chief advisor a man, Dominic Cummings, who's determined to rewire the inner workings of government. The Treasury is standing smack bang in the way of that plan, and neither the Prime Minister nor Dominic thought that Mr. Javid could take this on. I mean, Dominic Cummings has previously said that any shake-up will be messy, it will be difficult, and we did see the sort of things that Sajid Javid's team from Treasury were coming up with, whether it was to push for the idea of HS2 or certain tax regulations and new tax plans that would have been quite damaging anyway. So there is still time before the budget to make some U-turns and changes. Let's see how they do, basically, because it's not just Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson, there are others involved. Now, when it comes to the European Union, obviously we have the Brexit trade talks going on until December 2020, and the European Union have been coming up with some ridiculous demands to basically make us stay tied to the actual European project. But we finally had some responses from the government when it comes to fisheries. The European Union want to have access to UK waters for the next 25 years. Boris Johnson finally said no. Then we had obviously the European Court of Justice, ECJ, to be involved in decision making. Boris Johnson has finally said no. And now he's come out, the Prime Minister, to say that the EU trade demands are ridiculous and unreasonable. The government says that Brussels is being tougher on the UK over trade than it has been on other countries. And he's right. I don't understand why the European Union are still playing these games, because there's absolutely no need for it. We have officially left. They can't really keep us as a member anymore. There's a difference in obviously remaining and rejoining. There's no question about that. But now that we are an independent country, I don't understand why the EU aren't treating us in the same way that they treated Canada, for example, or South Korea when they were negotiating for a trade deal. It's because they're still holding a grudge, and they still hope that somehow Remainers could take over the government and basically rejoin the idiotic European project. But we need the government to stay strong on this, otherwise there's absolutely no hope. At this point, obviously, going out on WTO terms is still basically a reasonable option compared to what the EU are demanding. But we are where we are now, and on this channel we'll keep you guys posted as usual, and we'll try to hold politicians and the government to account, because the mainstream media out there aren't really doing their job properly. But on that note, obviously some of you know that we are starting a new media movement, a new media project to protect free speech and free press in this country. I will have some new updates for you guys very soon on about that. I've been talking to a number of big names. I'm going to get a team together to start a massive media outlet for you guys. So I'll keep you guys posted on that. If you enjoy the content, if you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe and click on the bell next to it so you get notified. We have a daily show at 5:45 p.m. GMT. If you want to follow me on social media, we have the Twitter and Instagram details down here. You can follow my daily rants about Brexit and current affairs. I'm Tousi. I'll see you guys tomorrow with a new video.